The small-town police station was always filled with noise. Phones rang, boots clicked on the tiled floor, and laughter often echoed through the narrow hallways. Among all the voices, there was one man who spoke the least. His name was Daniel. He was an officer who never raised his voice, never interrupted, and never tried to prove anyone wrong. He came to work quietly, did his job, and went home. To many at the station, he was invisible. Daniel had been serving for almost 15 years. He wasn't the type to show off or brag about arrests. He believed in doing things by the book. He noted everything in his small notebook: car numbers, small details about people, anything that seemed odd. His calm, careful ways made others think he was old-fashioned. The younger officers often joked about him, calling him Officer Slow Motion or Grandpa Dan. He would just smile and let it pass. Every morning, Daniel arrived before everyone else. He liked silence, the kind that existed just before dawn when the station was still waking up. He made his coffee, read the logbook, and checked his patrol route. Most of the time, he was given the same areas: quiet streets, closed factories, and empty parking lots. Others called them boring routes, but Daniel didn't mind. He believed every corner of town mattered, even the quiet ones. One day, while patrolling near the industrial area, Daniel noticed something strange. A fence behind an old warehouse had been cut open. The place had been closed for months after a small fire, and no one was supposed to be there. He got out of his car and looked around. There were fresh tire marks in the mud and footprints that led inside. He didn't see anyone, but something didn't feel right. He took photos and wrote down the details in his notebook before reporting it to the station. When he returned, he told his supervisor about what he saw. But the man barely looked up from his computer. "Probably just kids messing around," he said with a shrug. A few other officers laughed, one of them saying, "You worry too much, Dan. Maybe it's raccoons holding a meeting." Daniel smiled weakly. He didn't argue. But deep inside, he knew something wasn't normal. The next few days, he went back to that same area. Each time he noticed new signs: cigarette butts, fresh footprints, and once a parked van with tinted windows that disappeared as soon as he turned the corner. He noted everything and filed another report. Again, no one paid attention. "There's nothing out there," his partner told him one night. "Relax, Dan. You think too much." Daniel wanted to believe that, but his instincts told him otherwise. At home, his wife noticed the change in him. He would sit at the table after dinner, staring at his notebook. "You've been quiet lately," she said softly. "Is everything okay?" Daniel nodded. "Just work," he said. But his mind was racing. He couldn't stop thinking about the warehouse and the strange vehicles. He felt like something bad was coming, and he was the only one seeing it. One afternoon, the station held a briefing about small crimes in the area: car thefts, vandalism, and break-ins. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he mentioned the warehouse again. He explained how he'd seen the same suspicious van multiple times and believed it might be linked to something bigger. But before he could finish, a younger officer interrupted with a grin. "Here we go again, the mystery warehouse," he said. The room laughed. Even the sergeant smiled. Daniel fell silent and sat down. No one asked him to continue. He felt embarrassed, but more than that, he felt unseen. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He just wanted them to take his words seriously. For years, he'd watched how people underestimated quiet officers like him. The loud ones got the recognition. The calm ones got forgotten. Still, Daniel didn't change who he was. He believed that truth always found a way to be heard, even if it took time. Later that week, Daniel drove past the warehouse again at sunset. The air was heavy and dark clouds rolled in from the horizon. As he slowed down, he noticed a faint light flickering inside the building. It was quick, like someone closing a door. He parked a block away and walked closer, staying quiet. The broken fence was still open. Inside, he could hear muffled voices, low, cautious, and unfamiliar. His pulse quickened. He quietly stepped back, not wanting to alert anyone. When he got to his car, he called it in. "Dispatch, this is Officer Daniel," he said, keeping his voice calm. "I'm at the old warehouse on East Road. There's activity inside. Requesting backup." There was a pause. Then the dispatcher replied, half amused, "Copy that, Daniel. We'll note it down. Is it the same warehouse again?" He hesitated. "Yes, ma'am." "All right, we'll let the shift commander know." But no one came. Daniel waited in his car for over an hour. The light inside the building went out, and soon the voices were gone. He finally drove home feeling a mix of frustration and sadness. He knew that by morning everyone would just brush it off again. The next day, as expected, his report sat unread on the chief's desk. He overheard two officers joking about it in the hallway. "Maybe he's writing a novel about ghosts," one said. "Yeah, The Haunted Warehouse and starring Officer Daniel." They laughed as he walked by. He didn't say a word. He just kept walking. Later, while sitting in his patrol car, he looked out at the empty streets and thought about why he'd joined the force in the first place. It wasn't for medals or attention. He wanted to protect people, even if they didn't know it. But it was getting harder to do that when no one believed him. He looked at the dark sky above the quiet town and whispered to himself, "Something's coming. I can feel it." That night, before going to bed, he opened his notebook again. He went through every detail he had written. Dates, times, vehicle numbers, descriptions. Everything pointed to one thing. The warehouse wasn't abandoned. Someone was using it and they didn't want anyone to find out. He promised himself that no matter how many people laughed, he would keep watching. He had seen too much to ignore it now. The next morning he left home early again. His wife kissed his cheek and said, "Be careful today." He smiled and said, "Always." As he drove past the quiet streets, the town looked peaceful. Children walking to school, shop owners opening doors, buses rolling by. But Daniel's eyes kept scanning the roadsides, the corners, the hidden spots where danger often hides before it strikes. When he passed the industrial area again, he slowed down. The warehouse stood still in the distance, its broken windows reflecting the early sunlight. Everything seemed normal, but Daniel had learned that trouble rarely looks dangerous from far away. It hides in silence, waiting for the right moment. He sighed, closed his notebook and whispered, "One day, they'll see." Then he turned the car and continued his patrol, unaware that the quiet warning signs he'd been noticing were only the beginning of something far bigger, something that would change how everyone saw him forever. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel kept noticing more things that didn't sit right with him. The old warehouse that everyone ignored had started to change. He could tell by the marks on the ground, the new locks on the doors, and the faint smell of fuel that sometimes hung in the air. Once, while driving past, he noticed a man standing near the gate. The man turned his face away quickly when Daniel slowed down, as if trying not to be seen. That moment stayed with him all day. At the station, nothing had changed. People were busy with routine calls, traffic stops, small disputes, noise complaints. Daniel kept his head down, doing his part like always. But he couldn't let go of the strange things he was seeing. During lunch breaks, he would quietly check local records or security reports, hoping to find something that connected to that warehouse. Every clue pointed towards something being hidden there. Still, no one else seemed interested. One afternoon, he decided to drive by again. He parked his car a little farther this time, behind an old truck stop. From there, he had a clear view of the warehouse. For almost an hour, nothing happened. Then just as he was about to leave, a white van pulled up. 3 men stepped out, all wearing dark jackets. They didn't talk much, just looked around carefully and unlocked the gate. They moved inside quickly and shut the door behind them. Daniel wrote down the license plate and time. When he checked later, that plate didn't match any registered vehicle in the area. It was fake. That night at home, he couldn't focus on dinner. His wife noticed. "You've been quiet again," she said softly. "Is it that warehouse?" He gave a small smile and nodded. "I can't stop thinking about it. Something's going on there. I don't have proof yet, but my gut tells me it's not small." She reached for his hand. "You've done your job, love. You reported it. Maybe it's time to let it go." He looked at her, then shook his head gently. "If I let it go and something bad happens, I'll never forgive myself." He barely slept that night. His mind kept replaying what he'd seen, the van, the men, the hurried movements. By morning, he decided he needed to dig deeper. The next few days, he began to quietly talk to a few locals who lived near the industrial area. Some said they had seen lights at night too. Others mentioned hearing trucks but couldn't tell what was being moved. One old man who worked as a watchman nearby said, "They don't like anyone hanging around there. One of their men told me to mind my business last week." Daniel noted everything down. When he brought this up to his team during a small meeting, the reaction was the same as before. "You really love that warehouse." "Huh?" one of the younger officers joked. Another added, "Maybe you should move in there, Dan. You'd finally get some excitement." The laughter that followed made him lower his eyes. It didn't hurt him anymore, and he was used to being the quiet one. But it did make him realize he was truly on his own in this. Still, Daniel didn't stop. He adjusted his patrol route so that he could pass by the warehouse more often. He started to notice a pattern. Every Thursday night, a few vehicles would arrive between 9 and 10. They'd stay for about an hour and then leave. It wasn't random. Something regular was happening there. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but his instincts told him this was serious. One evening, he was writing his report when the sergeant walked by and saw the papers. "Still on that ghost chase?" he said, half amused. "Dan, listen. You've been a good officer for years, but you need to stop wasting time on this. The department has real problems." Daniel wanted to explain, but he knew it was useless. He simply said, "Yes, sir," and folded the papers. But as the sergeant walked away, Daniel whispered under his breath, "One day you'll see." That weekend, Daniel took a drive with his wife outside town, hoping to clear his head. The fields looked golden in the late afternoon light, and for a moment he felt peace. But when they stopped for gas, he saw something that made his chest tighten. One of the same vans he'd seen near the warehouse. It was parked by the side of the road with two men talking near it. He quickly paid for the gas and made note of the road they took when they drove off. He didn't tell his wife. He didn't want to worry her. When he returned to work, he checked the traffic cameras for that highway stretch, but the footage from that night was missing. The technician said the camera had been down for days. That didn't feel like an accident. He felt that quiet frustration again, like shouting in a room where no one listens. The following week, he started noticing small details others ignored. A few local shops had been broken into, but nothing valuable was taken. Just cleaning supplies, fuel, and empty containers. It didn't make sense. He wondered if these things were being used to cover something up. He collected every report that could be connected and created his own small file, labeling it simply East Road Activity. It wasn't official, but it was his way of keeping the truth organized. Sometimes, during night shifts, Daniel would sit in his patrol car outside the industrial area with the engine off, watching from a distance. The nights were long and quiet, broken only by the sound of crickets or the occasional bark of a dog. He would sip his coffee, glance at the warehouse, and jot down times when he saw headlights appear. Each entry in his notebook was like a piece of a puzzle no one else cared to solve. One night, while he was writing, a voice came through the radio. It was another officer joking, "Hey Dan, keeping the ghost company tonight?" He smiled slightly and replied, "Yeah, they're good listeners." The radio went silent. For once he didn't feel angry, just tired. He was trying to do his duty, and that was enough for him. At home, the distance between him and his wife started to grow. She loved him deeply, but she was worried. "You can't keep doing this to yourself," she said one morning. "You come home late, barely eat, and you look like you haven't slept in days." He rubbed his eyes and said quietly, "It's just work." She looked at him sadly. "No, it's that warehouse again. You're chasing something you can't even name." He didn't respond. He couldn't explain it. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something inside him telling him to keep watching, to not look away. The more he looked, the clearer the pattern became. There was movement, planning, and organization. This wasn't random crime, it was something bigger. One night as he drove by, he saw a truck leaving the area and turning toward the highway. He decided to follow at a distance. The truck stopped at a closed construction site, where two men quickly unloaded wooden crates. Before he could get closer, they drove off again. Daniel wrote down everything. He knew it was evidence, even if no one else did. Back at the station, he tried once more to speak with his superior. He brought the file, the photos, and his notes. But the response was the same as always. A tired smile and a shake of the head. "You've got a good imagination, Dan. Let it go." This time, Daniel didn't argue. He just walked out, his hands trembling slightly. He wasn't angry, just disappointed. Not in them, but in how easily truth gets buried under routine. That night, as he sat alone in his living room, he heard rain tapping against the windows. He looked at his notebook, filled with dates and notes no one cared to read. For the first time in years, he felt unsure. Was he really seeing something, or was he just trying too hard to find meaning where there was none? He closed his eyes and tried to rest, but in his heart he knew the answer. He wasn't wrong, he was early, and when the truth finally came out, everyone would know what he'd been trying to tell them all along. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. Daniel looked out the window and whispered to himself, "It's coming." Then he turned off the light, unaware that the next time he'd visit that warehouse, everything would change, not just for him, but for the entire town. The sky was dark that evening, heavy with clouds that looked ready to burst at any moment. Daniel sat in his patrol car near the edge of town, watching raindrops gather on the windshield. It had been another long day, and yet his mind was still stuck on the same thought: the warehouse on East Road. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something dangerous was hiding there. For weeks, he had been collecting small pieces of information. He'd filled almost half of his notebook now, each page a record of what he had seen or heard. Every time he thought he had enough to convince someone, it never worked. The department had stopped listening completely. Even his closest co-worker told him, "Let it go. Dan, you're going to give yourself a headache over nothing." But Daniel couldn't. He had seen too much. That night, the rain finally began to fall, slow at first, then heavier. Daniel started his car and decided to drive by the warehouse one more time. He didn't tell anyone. He knew they'd just laugh or tell him to go home. As he got closer, the roads grew quieter. Most of the town was asleep, and only the sound of rain hitting metal echoed through the streets. When he turned onto East Road, he saw something that made his heart skip. A line of vehicles, dark vans and pickup trucks, and was parked near the warehouse. He counted at least 6 of them. The gate was open and a dim light flickered inside. He parked far enough to stay unseen, turned off the engine, and sat in silence. He could see shadows moving around, people carrying boxes from one vehicle to another. It wasn't quick or messy. It looked organized, like they had done this many times before. Daniel grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Daniel," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "There's suspicious activity at the old warehouse on East Road. Multiple vehicles, multiple persons involved. Requesting immediate backup." There was a short silence before a tired voice replied, "Daniel, we've logged your report. Stay put, we'll send someone to check." He waited 10 minutes, then 20, but no one came. He called again. This time there was no response. Either the line was busy or they were simply ignoring him. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. He felt trapped between duty and doubt. He wasn't supposed to act alone, yet if he left, there'd be no proof. Finally, he decided to take a risk. He turned on his camera, clipped it to his jacket, and slowly stepped out of the car. The rain soaked his uniform instantly. He moved quietly, keeping to the shadows. As he got closer, he could hear low voices. Men were arguing about something, but not loudly, but with tension. He crouched behind a stack of barrels and peeked through a small gap. Inside the warehouse, a group of people was loading wooden crates onto a truck. One man was checking a list, another holding a flashlight. Daniel pulled out his phone and started recording from a distance. The rain made it hard to get a clear shot, but it was something. He zoomed in on the crates and noticed markings on them, foreign symbols and numbers he didn't recognize. His gut twisted. Whatever was going on here, it wasn't small-time theft. This was organized and serious. Suddenly, he heard a sound behind him, gravel crunching under a boot. He turned, heart racing, but saw nothing. For a moment, he froze. Then he realized it was just the wind pushing an old tin sheet against the fence. He exhaled slowly and stepped back toward his car. He didn't want to push his luck. Once inside, he wiped the rain from his face and started the engine quietly. He drove off with the headlights off until he reached the main road. Only then did he breathe properly again. The next morning, Daniel went straight to the station before his shift even started. His clothes were still damp and his eyes showed he hadn't slept. He walked into the chief's office and placed the phone and his notes on the desk. "Sir, I have footage and details. There's something big happening at that warehouse. I saw them loading crates last night. You have to look at this." The chief leaned back in his chair, sighing. "Daniel, I know you mean well, but this has to stop. You're getting obsessed. We can't waste time chasing shadows." "This isn't shadows," Daniel insisted. "I saw them. There were 6 vehicles. I have the recordings right here." The chief raised a hand. "I'll look into it when I can. For now, I'm assigning you to desk duty for a few days. You need rest, desk duty." That was his reward for trying to warn them. Daniel didn't argue. He knew there was no point. He picked up his phone and notes, walked out, and sat quietly at his desk the rest of the day, typing reports that didn't matter. Everyone else was laughing, talking, making plans for the weekend. He sat in silence, wondering why no one could see what was so obvious to him. That evening, as he left the station, the sky was turning orange. He walked slowly to his car, thinking about everything. He had evidence but no support. Maybe he was on his own in this. He started the engine and drove aimlessly through town, trying to think. Somewhere deep inside, he felt the weight of something coming, something he couldn't stop but had to prepare for. When he got home, his wife was waiting at the door. She could tell something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked. He hesitated before saying, "They put me on desk work. Said I need rest." She frowned. "Rest? You've been warning them for months, haven't you?" He nodded. "They don't believe me. None of them." She touched his hand gently. "Then maybe stop trying. If they won't listen, you can't make them." But Daniel couldn't let go. He sat by the window that night, watching the rain return. The reflection of the streetlight on the wet pavement looked like a warning sign. His notebook lay open on the table beside him. He turned the pages slowly, reading his own handwriting. Times, dates, details, vehicle numbers. Everything pointed to one truth. Something big was happening, and he was running out of time to prove it. A few days later, while still on desk duty, Daniel got a call from a local mechanic. "Officer, you asked me to keep an eye out for certain vans, right?" The man said. "Well, I saw one parked behind the old mill this morning. Looked the same as the one you showed me." Daniel thanked him and hung up. His pulse quickened. The old mill was only a few blocks from the warehouse. Maybe the two were connected. He couldn't resist. That night he went back out. Off duty, no uniform, just a flashlight and his phone. The town was quiet again except for the soft sound of rain. He drove to the old mill, parking far enough away to stay hidden. The place was dark, but he noticed faint light leaking from one of the windows. He crept closer and looked inside. There were people again, stacking crates just like before. He quietly recorded everything. Then as he turned to leave, his phone slipped from his hand and hit the ground. The sound echoed sharply in the night. He froze. One of the men inside shouted something. A door swung open and a flashlight beam cut through the darkness. Daniel crouched behind a wall, barely breathing. The beam moved closer, then stopped. He heard a voice mutter, "Probably just a cat," before the light disappeared back inside. Daniel waited another minute before grabbing his phone and leaving as quietly as he could. Back in his car, his heart was pounding. He looked at the footage, shaky but clear enough. He had proof now. Real proof. He knew he had to act fast before it was too late. The next morning, he printed the footage and left it in an envelope marked "Urgent" on the chief's desk. He didn't sign it. He knew his name would only make them doubt it again. Then he went home early and sat quietly in his living room. His wife asked if everything was all right. He looked at her and said softly, "I think something's about to happen. And I just hope I'm wrong." He wasn't wrong. Within the next few days, things would spiral in ways no one could have predicted. The quiet warnings he'd been giving for months were about to turn into something the whole town would hear. And when that moment came, everyone would remember the officer they never took seriously. Too late to make it right. The morning started like any other. The sky was clear, the streets quiet, and the station buzzing with small talk. Daniel sat at his desk, finishing up a few reports. It had been days since he'd left that anonymous envelope with the footage. No one had mentioned it. No one had called him in. It felt like nothing had changed. But somewhere deep inside, he knew something was coming. He could feel it. The same uneasy weight in his chest that had followed him for months. Around noon, he decided to step outside for some air. The sun felt warm on his face. For a moment, he tried to let go of the thoughts that haunted him. The warehouse, the strange vans, the long nights alone in the rain. Maybe he thought he had done all he could. But peace didn't last long. The call came just before 1 o'clock. The dispatcher's voice cracked through the radio. Sharp, urgent, unlike anything Daniel had heard before. All units respond immediately to East Road. Reports of multiple explosions and gunfire near the industrial area. Possible mass disturbance. The words hit him like a punch. East Road, the same warehouse. The one he'd been warning about all this time. For a few seconds, he couldn't move. The room around him went silent as officers jumped from their chairs, grabbing gear and weapons. Daniel grabbed his radio and ran for his car. The chief shouted something behind him, but he didn't stop. He turned on the siren and sped through the streets, his heart pounding so loud it drowned out the noise of the engine. As he neared the industrial area, a thick column of black smoke rose into the air. The closer he got, the worse it looked. Windows shattered. Flames climbed the sides of buildings. The warehouse he'd watched for months was burning. He pulled over and jumped out, coughing as smoke filled his lungs. The sound of sirens echoed everywhere. Police cars, fire trucks, ambulances. Chaos had taken over the quiet town. Officers were shouting orders, but no one seemed in control. The first team that went in had been ambushed. Daniel saw one of the younger officers being carried out, his leg bleeding. Another officer, pale and shaking, shouted that there were still men inside with weapons. Daniel's stomach dropped. He looked around. This was exactly what he had feared. The operation he had been tracking had exploded, literally, into a full-scale attack. Without thinking twice, he grabbed a vest from a nearby patrol car and ran toward the warehouse. Someone yelled after him, "Daniel, wait!" But he kept going. He knew the building better than anyone else there. He knew the layout, the exits, the paths the trucks had used. Smoke filled the air and debris fell around him as he pushed through the wreckage. Inside, the heat was unbearable. Flames licked the walls and the air stung his eyes. He moved slowly, calling out, "Police! Is anyone here?" A faint voice answered back, weak and desperate. He followed it, stepping over broken crates and twisted metal until he found two officers trapped behind a collapsed beam. One of them was barely conscious. Daniel tried to lift the beam, but it was too heavy. He looked around and spotted a metal pipe, using it as leverage. After a few tense minutes, he managed to free them both. "Can you walk?" he asked. One nodded weakly. "Go now, head to the south exit." "It's clear," they hesitated. "What about you?" "I'll cover the back," Daniel said firmly. They left, limping through the smoke, and he turned to move deeper into the building. Everywhere he looked, the evidence of what he had warned them about was scattered. Open crates filled with illegal supplies, maps, and strange tools. This had been no ordinary warehouse. It was a full operation, planned right under their noses. The sight filled him with a mix of anger and sadness. All those months he had tried to speak, and no one had listened. Now the truth was burning in front of them. He heard footsteps ahead and ducked behind a wall. Two men ran past, dressed in dark clothes, carrying bags. They didn't notice him. When they reached the back door, Daniel stepped out and shouted, "Police! Drop it!" One of them froze, the other bolted. Daniel chased after the one who ran, cutting through the smoke and into the open yard. The man reached a truck and started the engine, but Daniel slammed his shoulder against the door before it could close. They struggled for a moment, the man trying to push him off, but Daniel managed to pull the keys out and toss them aside. "Don't do this," Daniel said, breathing hard. "It's over." The man glared at him, panicked, then took off on foot toward the fence. Daniel didn't follow. He was exhausted and the fire was spreading fast. He stepped back, coughing hard, and leaned against the truck. The sound of more sirens filled the distance. Reinforcements were arriving at last. Within minutes, the area was crawling with officers and firefighters. They moved fast, pulling survivors out, extinguishing the flames, securing the scene. The once quiet warehouse district had turned into a battlefield. As Daniel stood there, covered in soot and sweat, the chief approached him. His face was pale, eyes wide with disbelief. "You were right," he said quietly. "You were right about everything." Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. He looked at the warehouse, still smoldering, and felt no satisfaction, only sadness. The cost of being right had been too high. People had been hurt. The town had been shaken, and all of it could have been avoided if someone had just listened sooner. As the night went on, the investigation began. Officers searched the area, finding more evidence, documents, weapons, vehicles, and cash. It was a massive operation that had been hiding in plain sight. Reporters started to gather at the perimeter, their cameras flashing, their voices buzzing with questions. But Daniel stayed in the background, leaning quietly against his patrol car. He wasn't interested in interviews or headlines. He just wanted to breathe. At one point, a young officer approached him. "They said you tried to warn us, sir, for months. Why didn't we listen?" Daniel looked at the ground for a moment before answering softly. "Sometimes people only see what they want to see. By the time they look closer, it's already too late." The young officer nodded, not knowing what else to say, then walked away. The night dragged on, and the fire finally died down. The once lively place was now a silent ruin. Daniel helped direct a few last teams, making sure the injured were taken care of. When everything was under control, he sat inside his car, staring out the windshield. The flashing lights from the emergency vehicles painted the wet pavement in red and blue. He felt tired, not just in his body, but deep inside his soul. He thought about all the times he had been laughed at, ignored, brushed aside. None of it mattered now. What mattered was that the truth had finally come out, even if it had to arrive through chaos. He looked at his notebook lying on the passenger seat, the same one that held all his warnings. He picked it up, flipped through the pages, and stopped at the first entry. Broken fence behind warehouse. Strange activity at night. He smiled faintly, a sad, weary smile. As dawn began to break, Daniel stayed there, watching the smoke rise into the early morning sky. He knew this wasn't over. There would be questions, reports, investigations. But for now, all he could think about were the people who had been hurt, his fellow officers, the townsfolk nearby, even the ones who had mocked him. He didn't hold anger toward them anymore. Only a quiet hope that next time maybe they'd listen before it was too late. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, Daniel started his car. The station called over the radio, asking for an update. He took a deep breath and replied softly, "Scene secure. Situation under control." Then he turned off the radio and drove home, the morning light cutting through the smoke behind him. He didn't know it yet, but this day, the day no one believed him until the very end, would change how everyone saw him forever. The town was quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet it had been before. It was heavier now, as if the air itself remembered what had happened. Days had passed since the fire and the raid at the warehouse, yet people were still talking about it everywhere, in shops, at bus stops, even at the little cafe near the station. The story had spread far and wide, and suddenly everyone knew the name of the officer who had once been ignored. Daniel tried to go back to work like normal, but normal didn't exist anymore. Every time he walked through the station doors, people looked at him differently. Some nodded with respect, some avoided his eyes, not out of dislike but out of guilt. They all knew he had been right from the start. He didn't rub it in. He just did his job quietly, the same way he always had. The chief called him into his office one morning. The blinds were half drawn and the smell of burnt coffee filled the room. The chief looked tired, older somehow, but his voice was calm. "Sit down," he said. "I've been thinking about everything that happened. You did what no one else here was willing to do. You kept watching when the rest of us turned away." Daniel didn't say anything. He didn't need praise. The chief leaned forward. "I spoke to the higher-ups. They want to promote you. You've earned it." Daniel looked down at his hands for a moment before answering softly, "Sir, I didn't do it for that. I just wanted people to be safe." "I know," the chief replied. "But you did what a real officer should do. You followed the truth even when no one believed you. That deserves recognition." He paused before adding, "Still, I get the feeling you're not happy about all this." Daniel gave a small, tired smile. "It's not about being happy, sir. It's about what we lost to finally see the truth." The chief nodded slowly. "You're right. But you gave this town something back too. Trust. People need that." When Daniel left the office, he didn't feel proud. He felt reflective. The promotion was official, but it didn't change what had happened. There were still injured officers recovering in the hospital. There were still families trying to make sense of what their loved ones had been involved in. The warehouse had been the heart of something dark, and tearing it open had come at a price. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. The images replayed in his mind, the fire, the smoke, the faces of the people he'd helped. He got out of bed and went to his small kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hear your own heartbeat. He sat down by the window and looked out at the street. A cat crossed under the dim light of a lamppost, and in the distance, the faint hum of a late-night truck echoed. He thought about the first day he had noticed something strange behind that warehouse. It had seemed so small then, just a broken fence, some lights at odd hours. But that small thing had grown into something much bigger. It reminded him that sometimes the biggest dangers don't appear out of nowhere. They build up quietly, hidden in plain sight. A few days later, he visited the hospital to check on the injured officers. One of them, a young man he had pulled out of the warehouse fire, smiled when he saw Daniel walk in. "You saved my life," the man said quietly. Daniel shook his head. "You'd have done the same for me." "Maybe," the man said. "But I wouldn't have been there if you hadn't been paying attention. Everyone ignored you, and you still didn't stop. That means something." Those words stayed with him. On his way out, he passed a family waiting in the hallway. They recognized him from the news. The mother stood up and said, "You're the one who found out about those people, aren't you?" Daniel nodded slowly. She looked at him for a long moment and said, "Thank you. My brother worked near that warehouse. If the fire had spread any further, he might not be here today." He didn't know what to say. He simply nodded again and gave her a small smile before walking away. The following week, an award ceremony was held at the town hall. It was supposed to honor the officers who had shown bravery during the crisis. Daniel didn't want to go, but the chief insisted. The hall was filled with townsfolk, reporters, and police officials. When Daniel's name was called, he walked to the stage quietly. The applause was loud, but it felt distant. He stood under the bright lights, feeling out of place. The mayor shook his hand and said, "This town owes you more than words can say. You reminded us what true dedication looks like." Daniel looked out at the crowd. Faces he recognized, faces that once doubted him. He took a breath and said softly, "I just did what any of us should do. I saw something wrong and couldn't ignore it. I made mistakes too, but I learned that sometimes doing the right thing means standing alone for a while. I hope next time we'll listen to each other a little sooner." The hall went quiet for a moment before the applause started again, stronger this time. But Daniel didn't linger. As soon as it was over, he slipped out the side door and walked down the quiet street toward the park. He sat on a bench under a tree and watched as the sun began to set. Kids were playing on the swings nearby, their laughter echoing through the cool evening air. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt something close to peace. He thought about how much had changed, how the town that once ignored him now looked up to him. But deep down, he didn't want fame or attention. He just wanted to know that what he did had made a difference. In the days that followed, Daniel kept working as usual. He still went out on patrol, still stopped for coffee at the same corner shop, still nodded at the same people who now greeted him with warmth instead of indifference. The town slowly started to heal. The damaged buildings were repaired, the burned warehouse cleared away. Life was returning, though with new caution. One afternoon, while filing paperwork, Daniel found a small envelope on his desk. Inside was a short note. It said, "Sometimes the quietest voices carry the truth the farthest. Don't stop being one of them." There was no signature. He smiled faintly. It didn't matter who sent it. The message was enough. Months passed, and the incident that had once shaken the town became part of its history. People moved on, but Daniel's story remained, not as a tale of tragedy, but as one of perseverance. Every rookie officer at the station knew about him. The story of the man who kept believing even when no one else did became a quiet lesson passed around the halls. One evening, Daniel drove out to the edge of town where the warehouse used to stand. The area had been cleared, and the land was now empty, covered in grass and wildflowers. He parked his car and stepped out, walking slowly through the open field. The wind was gentle, carrying the scent of rain. He stopped in the middle of the field and closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about everything that had happened, the fear, the doubt, the fire, and the truth that finally came out. It all seemed distant now, like a memory that no longer hurt. As the sky turned orange and pink, Daniel whispered quietly to himself, "Maybe this is what it means to make peace with the past." He smiled and turned back toward his car. The drive home was calm. He rolled down the window, letting the evening breeze hit his face. The streets were quiet, but this time it felt like a good kind of quiet, peaceful, alive. He knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, new people, But he also knew something else. That sometimes one person's persistence can change everything. And so, as the lights of the town came into view, Daniel felt lighter than he had in months. The pain, the loneliness, the doubt, all of it had led to this moment of understanding. He had learned that doing the right thing doesn't always bring applause or comfort, but it brings clarity, and in that clarity there's peace. He parked the car outside his small house, stepped out, and looked up at the sky. The stars were beginning to appear, one by one, quietly shining, just like he had all along.